The following program is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network, available on the free YouTube channel General Grant by himself, or Dr. E.C. Fields. Also on the Facebook page, Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and on various other social media. The campsite and headquarters is generalgrantbyhimself.com. This program is one of those presentations in the ongoing series, General Grant Looks at the American Civil War, wherein General Grant looks at a person, place, or event in the Civil War for reflection and observation. Permission to copy and distribute is given, and indeed encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. And now, the River Queen Conference, March the 28th of 1865. I am Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, and you find me this day here in my library where you join me, and I should like very much to reflect upon the, some say famous, conference held on the morning of March the 28th of 1865, where President Lincoln, General Sherman, Admiral David D. Porter, and myself met with the President for about 3 hours. The conference was over at noon, ran from 8:30 or so until about noon when we all left. But there's much that I should like to tell you about the events surrounding that momentous meeting where we determined what to do about the end of the war, essentially. On June the 15th of 1864, I had gone into siege with General Lee inside. He was inside the Petersburg lines, and then we began what became an 11-month siege. In May of 65, Julia began to harp on me, actually, about inviting the president down to visit us at City Point. And I always resisted this because I told Julia that he's the president of the United States. He's the general-in-chief. He may go where he pleases, when he pleases. I don't have to invite him. And she said, you know, he's probably sensitive about coming to this camp because of his reputation for meddling in the military affairs in the war. And he probably feels like to come down here and visit would be his meddling, or viewed as his meddling. Invite him. And I said no. And I resisted this several times. But on Monday, March the 20th, Julia and I were at our telegraph office, and Robert Lincoln, who's a captain on my staff now, the president requested that I put him on the staff, was there as well. And Julia asked him, do you think your father would come and visit us? And he said, oh, I expect he would if he was invited. Julia gave me more than a knowing look, and I put up my hands and I said, all right. So on March the 20th, I sent the president a telegram that says, can you not visit City Point for a day or two? I would like very much to see you, and I think the rest would do you good. Respectfully, U.S. Grant, etc., so forth. To my surprise, later that day into the evening, I got a response in cipher, of course, and it said, your kind invitation is received. Had already thought of going immediately after the next rain. Will go sooner if any reason for it. Mrs. L. and a few others will probably accompany me. Will notify you of the exact time once it shall be fixed upon. Well, the motion was made and seconded, so to speak, and the president spent the next 2 days securing transportation. And at first he contacted Secretary of the Navy Gideon Wells, and Wells put him in contact with Captain David Barnes of the USS Bat, B-A-T. And the captain came over and spoke with me. Now, Lincoln, as I understand, was very cagey. He wouldn't tell Captain Barnes exactly what he had in mind, but he was asking him about the accommodations. Now, Lincoln knew that Mrs. Lincoln, Taddy as he called him, Tad, his bodyguard George H. Crook, was going to go with him, or they were going to go with him. And so Bat told him, well, we can adapt, or rather Captain Barnes told him, we can adapt the Bat to fit your needs. But when the president found that a nurse and Mrs. Lincoln and Taddy and George Crook and so forth were going, he said, we're going to need a bigger boat. So they decided to go with the River Queen, 481, or rather 181 foot long side wheeler and burthen 426 tons. She's a good sized boat and much more commodious for the president, what he needed. So they decided that the River Queen would be the president's boat, escorted by the Bat, which was more than necessary because just before, a few weeks before, a sister ship to the River Queen had been exploded with a coal bomb. And indeed, at City Point headquarters, there had been a coal bomb put into one of the ships there at the wharf, and it exploded and killed, I think, 43 men. Some of them, they just never found them. They were atomized. And a tremendous loss of property, over and above 43 men losing their lives. So the idea of coming from Washington City down to City Point, where the James and Appomattox rivers meet, was a bit hazardous. So the Bat escorted the president. They left the 7th Street Wharf on the morning of March 23rd, and they sailed that night. It was smooth sailing at first, and as I understand, though, when they got out into the waters of Chesapeake Bay with the ocean waves and so forth, the president and George Crook, his bodyguard, were very ill, very, very ill. And the president had a dream that the next morning they got back into the river there to go to Fortress Monroe, out of the ocean-influenced waters off the bay and into the river to go to Fortress Monroe. And Lincoln told Mary, his wife, that morning that he had dreamed the night before that the White House had burned down, that it was on fire and had burned down. President Lincoln puts great store in those dreams, although he dismisses them publicly. Mary Lincoln puts great store indeed in those dreams. She is a subscriber to the occult. And when they stopped at Fortress Monroe on the morning of the 24th, she went ashore and got fresh water. And while she was there, they were getting fresh water. She telegraphed back to the White House to see if indeed it was all right. They told her it was all right. There was no problem. And they left that afternoon to come down to City Point and arrived at about 9 p.m. on Friday, March the 24th. Robert Lincoln was looking for them and met them. And my headquarters were up on the hill, the bluff overlooking the river. And Robert had gone down to meet them, had a few moments with his parents and with his little brother Tad, came up and got myself and Julia, and we went down and met with the Lincolns. Now that's Friday night, March 24th. And other than the momentum gaining for us to have that meeting for the River Queen Conference, another parallel situation began to develop, because the president told Mrs. Lincoln and Julia that I want to speak with the general in private, and we left. Mary Lincoln was seated on a small sofa there in the cabin and told my wife Julia, please have a seat, Mrs. Grant. And Julia did so, and she sat on the sofa beside Mrs. Lincoln. Mrs. Lincoln was horrified, as Julia tells me, and Julia realized immediately that she had committed a real social error as far as Mrs. Lincoln was concerned. And she said, "Oh, Mrs. Lincoln, I fear I crowd you," and jumped up. Mrs. Lincoln made what Julia says at best could be a weak gesture and said, "No, take your seat again." So Julia sat back down, but only long enough until she could gracefully get up and move to an adjacent chair. That's where the friction began to develop. Now, Julia was staying aboard the Martin in the bay when she wasn't with me in my headquarters cabin. My men had built an addition to the cabin about double the size of the ordinary cabin there for her to stay with me, but she also stayed on the Martin out in the bay. Well, the Martin was closest to the pier. Mrs. Lincoln did not like that. She would not go past the Martin to get on the pier. So the captain of the Martin and the captain of the River Queen were jockeying back and forth all the time to move the River Queen closest to the pier. So Mrs. Lincoln didn't have the Martin between her and the presidential boat and the pier, and that happened back and forth several times. Well, the next day, on Saturday, March the 25th, the president was scheduled to go out to General Meade's headquarters and have a review of the troops. But about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, General Lee's forces had made a savage assault against Fort Stedman in our lines, and there was quite the battle going on. By 6 o'clock or so, Robert Lincoln went down to the River Queen and met his father and Taddy having breakfast, and told him that there wasn't going to be a review today. There was a fight going on, and apparently a big one. Lincoln considered what else he was going to do. He did send Secretary Stanton a telegram that said, there has been, he described it, as I recall, there's been a little dust up down the line and a little rumpus down the line, and it ended pretty much where it started. Now, he didn't intend to be disdainful of the fight. Many men were killed and wounded in it, but it turned out that, as he termed it, that little rumpus down the line was actually Robert E. Lee's last major offensive of the war there at Fort Stedman. So he visited. Admiral Porter arrived about midday, and it was hail fellow well met with them, and they met and discussed and talked, and then he met with myself and Porter and some of my other staff. Everybody wanted to see the president, and I wanted everyone who could to come in and see the president. And along about early afternoon, we got word that the battle was over, or essentially over, and the president wanted to go. He wanted to go to the fight. There was still fighting going on. I said, no, there's no way that we're going to do that, Mr. President. But George Meade had sent us word, he was on the scene, that it had pretty much died down. So we boarded the cars, took a ride on the cars down to Patrick Station, which we felt would be the safest place for the president to see what had happened, or what was indeed still happening. When we got to the end of the line near Patrick Station, there's still a way to go. So the president got on my horse, Jeff Davis, which is a short, ugly, squat horse. But he's got the most comfortable, I call him my rocking chair. He's got the most smooth ride I've ever had on a horse. And the president was on him. I rode Cincinnati. The president's legs extended down way beyond the animal's belly, and there was a lot of joking and teasing of the president, himself leading it. I resolved that thereafter the president would ride Cincinnati and I would ride Jeff Davis, which we did. But we were riding, of course it's very muddy, been raining off and on, heavily raining, and Julia and Mrs. Lincoln were riding in an Army ambulance with Colonel Adam Badeau. Now, Badeau was sitting with his back to the front facing Julia and Mrs. Lincoln, and we've corduroyed the roads, laid trees side to side so that you could get across or through the mud, which was hip deep, and the animals could move. So they're on a corduroyed road, and they're bouncing up and down. There's no suspension at all in those ambulances. Just ask any wounded soldier who's had to ride in one. And they're passing the time of day as best they can. And at one point, they were bounced so high that Julia and Mrs. Lincoln's bonnets were crushed down upon their heads. And as Badeau was talking, he's just idly chatting and passing the time, and he talked about Mrs. George Griffin, Charles Griffin, General Griffin's wife, and that she was with the party riding the horses to see the battle. Mrs. Lincoln was like striking a Lucifer, immediately went into a rage and said, "What do you mean, sir, having that woman being with the president? Was she alone with the president? Do you mean to tell me that he would prefer her to be with him?" And that was the nicest thing she said. She told the driver, "Stop, let me out." She was going to walk through knee-deep mud to get to the president. She said, "Well, I'll see about this." Went into a towering rage. Now, Julia is trying to calm her down, which didn't do Julia any good as far as Mrs. Lincoln was concerned. And they did keep her from jumping out of the wagon. They had arrived at Meade's headquarters. He met the wagon. Meade took her on his arm and went to his tent. Now, Badeau told Meade afterward he was in misery because he knew Meade has a towering temper as well. And Mrs. Lincoln was already in a towering temper. But he walked off, and they spent a few minutes making their social graces and speaking. He escorted her back to the wagon. And she tells Badeau, "Sir," very archly as Julia described it, "Mr. Meade, General Meade, is a gentleman indeed. And he has advised me that Secretary of War Stanton himself gave Mrs. Griffin permission to be here with the party. Thank you very much." And they were able to calm that down for the moment, only through what General Meade told her. Well, the president found out about this later. When we went back to City Point, the ladies went to their various ships, the River Queen for Mrs. Lincoln and the Martin for Julia, and President Lincoln joined us actually at my campfire. And again, I had my officers and staff, everyone that could come around and join us, because everybody wanted to see the president. And he visited with us. He talked about the war, the pressure he had gotten from people wanting jobs, sisters wanting to get their brothers freed from the stockade, mothers wanting their sons who deserted or committed the crime to keep him from having them executed. The politicians, Congress had changed in the midterm elections, and he no longer had a supportive Congress. And it was so wonderful for him to sit there around the fire with us and to just be able to visit and talk. But when he left, Theodore Lyman, he's the fellow who said that I looked like I could put my head through a brick wall and was about to do it. Theodore Lyman wrote this about President Lincoln after that campfire soiree. And he said, "The president is, I think, the ugliest man I ever put my eyes on. There is also an expression of plebeian vulgarity in his face that is so offensive you recognize the recounter of coarse stories." President Lincoln was known to like an off-color coarse joke. So Lyman said, "You recognize the recounter of coarse stories. On the other hand, he has the look of sense and wonderful shrewdness, while the heavy eyelids give him a mark almost of genius. He strikes me, too, as a very honest and kindly man, and with all his vulgarity, I see no trace of low passions in his face. On the whole, he is such a mixture of all sorts as only America brings forth. He is as much like a highly intellectual and benevolent satyr as anything I can think of. I never wish to see him again, but as humanity runs, I am well content to have him at the head of affairs. So we all went to bed that evening. The president bid us adieu, and he and Mrs. Lincoln retired. Now, the next morning, on Sunday, March the 26th, he came to my headquarters, came up the hill to my headquarters. He met with myself, Meade, Sheridan was there, Phil Sheridan, General Ord, and Porter. He teased Sheridan, which only he can do, because Sheridan does not like being teased about his height, which is 5'5" on a good day. And the president ragged him about the big cavalry boots and the little man sitting astride the big horse, Rienzi, which he had renamed Winchester. But he met with Sheridan, Ord, Meade, Porter, and myself, and we just talked and passed the time of the day. Then he had to deliver some telegrams. He went to the telegraph office, and a most touching story comes about from that. When he went to the telegraph office, he saw 3 kittens mewing and crawling around on the floor of the office. And he looked at them, he sat down, and he picked all 3 of them up and put them in his lap. And he said, "Where is the mother of these little things?" And the soldiers in the telegraph office said, "Well, Mr. President, their mother's been dead." He teared up, he cried. And he said, "With all of the death, all of the misery that has been caused by this war, it has even extended, it seems, unto these 3 little helpless kittens. Will not somebody take care of them and see that they're well cared for?" Of course, I understand by this time, even the soldiers in the office are tearing up. And they assured him, "Yes, Mr. President, they'll be well taken care of." And I believe that even unto this day, they're still well cared for. But the president then, we got aboard the ship and went upriver a bit because the president wanted to go to Aiken's Landing, which is near Dutch Gap. Aiken's Landing is the exchange point, according to the Dix Hill agreement that we've got for exchange of prisoners. And he was going to review the troops. Well, we got there a bit late. Now, this is the afternoon of the 26th, and we got there a little late. Soldiers were all lined up for the review, and Julia and Mrs. Lincoln were delayed. Well, the president decided these troops have been lined up, they've missed their lunch hour, and that he was going to go ahead and do the inspection and review them. And we could catch, or the women could catch up later. So the president, myself, and me, and General E.O.C. Ord, and all began to do the review. Now, with us, though, was the wife of General Ord, General E.O.C. Ord, and Mrs. Ord, as I recall, Mary is her first name, is known to be, she's described as a very handsome lady. In fact, she's been described as the prettiest woman in Washington City. She's also an accomplished equestrian and was riding. She was there with the party. Now, she was waiting for Mrs. Lincoln and Julia to get there again in an ambulance, this time with Adam Badeau and Colonel Horace Porter. And they're bouncing and jouncing and bumping up and down again on the corduroy road, and again in no good humor. Well, Mrs. Lincoln spotted Mrs. Ord at the periphery of the riding party that was going to the president and myself and other officers to do the review. When Mrs. Ord, about the same time, saw the ambulance coming and that the wives were in it, Mrs. Ord said, "I need to go back and join the wives," which she was eager to do to visit with Mrs. Lincoln. So she gallops over to meet the ambulance. Well, Mrs. Lincoln has seen her, and she again, like striking a Lucifer, goes into a towering rage. And by the time Mrs. Ord got there, Mrs. Lincoln was snarling at her and demanding, "What do you mean, madam, by being with my husband, the president," and so forth, and was loud and abusive. Mrs. Grant was trying to calm her down, and at that point, Mrs. Lincoln turned her wrath on Julia and said, "Well, I suspect you want to be in the White House as well, that you expect to be there." And Mrs. Grant, Julia, said, "Well, I'm quite content with my position. I'm higher now than I ever expected to be." And Mrs. Lincoln wouldn't let it go and said, "Well, you'll find it quite nice indeed, madam." And by this time, Mrs. Ord, sitting her horse outside the ambulance, is in tears and crying. Now the president comes back and tries to comfort her, but she was not to be comforted, and it was greatly embarrassing to him. It was obvious. Adam Badeau described the look on the president's face as that of Christ going to the cross, of pain, being in pain, but resigned to his fate. Very eloquent statement indeed of the pain that was on the president's face. So we all went back to City Point and to the River Queen. The president held an impromptu dance, called a band aboard, regimental band aboard, and they were having a dance. The president did not dance, but Mrs. Lincoln was still throwing a fit in the party and demanding the immediate dismissal of General Ord, saying he was incompetent, all manner of insults, and I defended him. It didn't matter if she was the president's wife. She was impugning the good name of one of my staunch and tried and true officers. And I said, "No, ma'am, none of that's true. He's a good officer," which did not endear me with Mrs. Lincoln. But finally, the president gets her to go back to their cabins, and they fought well into the night. Captain Barnes of the Bat was summoned to their cabin, and Mrs. Lincoln said, "Do you not agree with me?" And Captain Barnes told me, "I refused to umpire that situation. I declined," which led to Mrs. Lincoln requesting that he leave the boat. The next day, he requested that he leave the boat. Well, by Monday, the 27th, the morning of the 27th, the president went up to, on the Appomattox River, the Point of Rocks, which is a landmark. And there was also an observation tower, a very tall observation tower that had been built earlier in 1864. And the whole party goes up there, and the president wanted to climb the observation tower. He's very physically fit. And he and I climbed the very tall tower, enjoyed the view, came back down, and went back to City Point. Sherman had arrived by that time. He was able to get away from the Army, left General John Schofield in command of the Army, facing Johnston there at Bentonville in North Carolina. And he came up on the Russia, got off the Russia, came over and met the president, and it was indeed, hail fellow, well met. And they visited for quite a while, and then Sherman returned to his boat. But I should also, before I go too much further, I want to read you a description of the review that my 6-year-old at the time son, Jesse, wrote about that grand review between going to the review and coming back to find Mrs. Lincoln emotionally destroying Mrs. Ord. But about the review, Jesse, now this is the point of view of a 6-year-old. Now he wrote it many years later, but he said about the review, The bands were playing, and many of the staff horses, seasoned troopers though they were prancing. Father's horse in particular danced along with arching neck and curving body. But the horse President Lincoln rode walked calmly, almost as though conscious that his burden must be carried with anxious care, while the president sat stiffly erect, the reins hanging slack from his hands. Father was but 42 years old then, but I had always looked upon him as the largest, and next to my grandfather Dent, the oldest man in the world. But beside President Lincoln, Father looked small, and for the first time I saw him as a young man. In a tightly buttoned frock coat and wearing a high hat, Mr. Lincoln appeared enormously tall, much taller than when standing. And to me, the boy watching, the unsmiling, worn, but kindly face, the tall, black-coated form riding before that colorful throng, gave a feeling of awe that time has not effaced. Quite a description of a review with the president by a 6-year-old boy. But sadly, after that was over, he rode back into the firestorm about Julia and Mrs. Ord. So we returned to City Point. And after they had met Sherman, they retired for the night. The next morning, on Tuesday, March the 28th, in the morning, the president came over and to my headquarters, and he and Admiral Porter and General Sherman and myself went to the president's cabins on the River Queen. Now, it began, I gave a description of the military situation around the country, and then Admiral Porter described the naval situation. And Sherman said, after the president expressed some concern about him being away from the Army, he said that John Schofield was more than competent to be in command in his absence, and that he said, we're strong enough to do anything, repel anything that Joe Johnston wants to do. And even if Lee were to get away from Grant and get down and join Johnston, they'd have an army of some 80,000 men. They could handle him well until I and the Army of the Potomac got down to join them. So he soothed the president's, I think for the most part, he soothed the president's concerns. But Lincoln went on to say, as far as the war being over, let them up easy. Let them keep their horses. Let them keep their weapons. Indeed, if they want them, they can shoot squirrels when they get back home. But they can get a crop in. Let them go and get back home. I want them home. It doesn't matter how we get them home. Get them home. It doesn't matter to me if Jeff Davis gets out of the country, but let them keep their horses. Let them, if they want, let them keep their sidearms. Let them up easy. We want these people to be our friends after all of this fighting and killing has stopped. Sherman wanted tougher terms than that, and the president listened to him. Sherman said, we don't have to be easy on them. We can be definitive with them. And the president said, you may be right. That may be the way to handle it, but my way is a sure way to bring about peace and good relations, as good as they can be after the fighting stopped. Let's try my way first. If we have to do your way, we'll do that afterward. And indeed, as it turns out, we went his way, which was indeed the sure way. And about noon, the conference broke up. Sherman went back, got on the Russia, and went back to his troops in North Carolina. Porter rejoined the Navy, and we parted company the next day when I went to get back with the Army and to pursue Lee. Now, in the aftermath, Sherman said when he left, let me relate what he said about having met Lincoln again. I know when I left him, I was more than ever impressed by his kindly nature, his deep and earnest sympathy with the afflictions of the whole people resulting from the war, and that his earnest desire seemed to be to end the war speedily without more bloodshed or devastation, and to restore all the men of both sections to their homes. In the language of his second inaugural address, he seemed to have charity for all, malice toward none, and, above all, an absolute faith in the courage, manliness, and integrity of the armies in the field. Of all the men I ever met, he seemed to possess more of elements of greatness combined with goodness than any other. Well, Porter was back with the Navy. Sherman was back with the Army of the Tennessee. I was back working with the Army of the Potomac and going in pursuit of Lee after he evacuated Petersburg. But an ending to all of this after the City of the River Queen Conference. That night, Mr. Smith came aboard the River Queen on the night that we all broke up. He was shabbily dressed, like George Crook described, swarthy, shabbily dressed, nervous yet aggressive, and he demanded to see President Lincoln. And Mr. Crook, George Crook, said, "No, you can't see him." Mr. Smith persisted, and he said, "I'm a heavy contributor to Mr. Lincoln's campaign and will continue to be so. I must see him." And he was refused. He said, "I've got to see him." And George Crook said, "Well, let me ask the president." He went and asked Mr. Lincoln. Lincoln says, "I don't know him. He's an imposter. I won't see him." So George Crook went back and told Mr. Smith, "The president doesn't know you." And Mr. Smith swelled up, as Crook described it, and he said, "If Mr. Lincoln does not know me now, he will know me damned soon after he sees me." And Crook called for the guard. Mr. Smith took his leave abruptly and went down the gangplank into the darkness. Now, 2 weeks later, the president is assassinated. Now, Crook, William H. Crook, described Mr. Smith that night in this manner. "After the death of Mr. Lincoln, everyone was anxious to discover the accomplices of the murderer. I called attention to this man, Smith, who had tried so hard to be admitted to Lincoln's presence at City Point. It was known that Surratt had been at City Point at that time, and I was requested to visit Surratt and see if I could identify him as Smith. I went to court and Taddy went with me. I had seen Surratt before the war. We had lived in the same county in Maryland. I think Smith and Surratt were the same man. It was impossible, however, for me to be absolutely sure, for Smith was ragged and dirty and very much sunburnt. He looked like a tramp, while Surratt, at the time I saw him, looked like a very sick man, pale and emaciated. In every other respect, they looked alike. The difference in appearance might easily have been brought about by circumstances or by a slight disguise. I shall always believe that Surratt was seeking an opportunity to assassinate the president at this time." So the period of several days from March the 24th of the president getting to City Point to March 28th of the morning of the 28th when we had the conference, you can see that much transpired. The conference itself lasted less than 4 hours, but much was decided, much was expressed, and much occurred during that time period. So that is all that I've got to say in reflecting about the conference on the River Queen on March the 28th of 1865. And for the moment, I must needs bring my comments to a close. I'm glad you saw fit to join me here in the library this day. And until the next time we come together and I reflect upon a person, place, or event in the war, I bid you, as Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, a very fond and warm adieu.